Tunisia, spring 1943. The North African sun hammered down on the dusty training ground outside Gafsa. The war had turned against the Axis here. Rommel's panzers were retreating, the Afrika Korps hollowed by fuel shortages and airstrikes. Yet, for the Americans, victory had come at a painful price. The green troops of the two corps had been bloodied at Kasserine Pass. Their rifles were solid, their tanks decent. But when a German Panzer IV appeared, even a good man could feel helpless. Infantrymen had one supposed answer: the M1 Bazooka, a tubular shoulder-fired rocket launcher, 54 inches of hope and frustration. It looked modern, even futuristic. But in the dry heat of Tunisia, it was almost useless. The rocket's electrical ignition often failed. The warhead, though shaped like a cone, barely dented German armor. "Might as well throw rocks," one private muttered after a round fizzled out 10 yards from its target. To the men who carried it, the bazooka was a symbol of American ingenuity that had stumbled. It had been rushed into service the previous year, a marriage of a shape-charged warhead and a crude launch tube. On paper, it should have pierced 3 inches of steel, enough to cripple a Panzer III or IV. In practice, the early M6 rockets burned inconsistently, their propellant degrading in the African sun. Some misfired, some veered off like drunk birds. In combat, soldiers reverted to grenades or called for tank support. Back in Washington, the Ordnance Department knew it had a problem. The bazooka had been a brilliant concept, but its heart, the shape charge, was too weak and its firing mechanism unreliable. Worse, it had been designed for the lightly armored tanks of 1942. Now, in 1943, the Germans were rolling out the Panther and Tiger, armored beasts the current bazooka couldn't even scratch. That was when a young engineer named Edward Uhl found himself staring at a stack of test reports that all told the same story: failure. Uhl was an Army ordnance officer, barely in his 30s, working out of the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. He wasn't a combat veteran, but he understood weapons the way a pilot understands wind. When his superior, Colonel Leslie Skinner, gave him the assignment, "Fix it if you can," Uhl didn't see opportunity. He saw an engineering trap. The weapon was too light, too crude, too underpowered, and yet he knew soldiers were dying because of it. The idea was sound, he would later recall, but the details were killing it. He began by breaking down the rocket itself. The warhead used a copper liner to focus explosive force into a jet, a principle called the Monroe effect. But the geometry was wrong. The copper cone was too shallow, the explosive fill uneven. Worse, the detonator wasn't placed properly to form a coherent jet. In simple terms, it didn't focus its punch, it just spread it. Uhl ran dozens of tests, different cone angles, better explosives, new detonator designs. He scavenged parts, borrowed test time, and argued with superiors for more materials. One afternoon, as smoke cleared from a failed firing test, he noticed a pattern. When the cone angle was slightly deeper, the penetration doubled. It was a clue, one that led him to the critical insight. The bazooka's warhead didn't need more explosive, it needed better direction. But the real breakthrough came when Uhl tried to solve the launcher's ignition failures. The early model used a dry cell battery that often corroded or failed under heat. So he replaced it with a magneto trigger, a simple generator that created its own current each time the trigger was pulled. No more batteries, no more desert failures. Suddenly, the bazooka could fire reliably, rain, sand, or snow. It was an elegant fix, born not from new materials, but from sheer persistence. By summer 1943, Uhl's modified prototype, dubbed the M9, was ready. It was lighter, more reliable, and its improved M6A3 rocket could pierce up to 4 inches of armor at 100 yards. Still not a Tiger killer, but enough to stop most tanks from the side or rear. The new design folded in half for easier carrying and was built with aluminum instead of steel, a small miracle of wartime engineering. When the Army's test board asked whether it could be fielded quickly, Uhl answered with calm conviction, "It's ready when the troops are." He was right, but it would take the hedgerows of Normandy and a new kind of battlefield desperation to prove it. Normandy, June 1944. The hedgerows of the Cotentin Peninsula were as far from the Tunisian desert as one could imagine, green, damp, and claustrophobic. To an infantryman, it felt like fighting inside a maze of earth and leaves. The Germans knew every corner. They turned sunken lanes into trenches, farmhouses into fortresses, and the thick Norman hedges into natural armor. The M1 bazooka, that unreliable relic of North Africa, was gone. In its place, the men of the 29th Infantry Division carried Uhl's new weapon, the M9A1 bazooka, foldable, sleek, and most importantly, dependable. It fired a heavier M6A3 rocket that burned clean and straight. For the first time, the weapon in a GI's hands could decide the outcome of a tank encounter. The first true test came outside St. Lo in July 1944. Private Jack Dawson, a 23-year-old farm boy from Indiana, was crouched behind a low embankment with his squad when the sound came. The grinding rumble of a Panzer Fürst's treads, faint at first, then unmistakable. "We could feel it before we saw it," he would later write. The tank's gun swung like a slow pendulum, scanning for targets through the mist and brush. Dawson had fired the old bazooka in Sicily and had cursed it. But now, as his loader slid a rocket into the tube and tapped his shoulder, he whispered a prayer, not for courage, but for ignition. He rose, aimed at the side of the turret, and squeezed the trigger. A flash, a hiss, and a trail of white smoke streaked across the hedgerow gap. The rocket struck just below the turret ring, a metallic crack, a jet of fire, and then a muffled whoomp from inside. The Panzer shuddered, halted, and began to smoke. Dawson's squad stared in disbelief. "She lit up like a furnace door," he said afterward. The bazooka had done it. It had killed a tank. Word spread quickly through the platoons. The new bazookas worked, not just against half-tracks or pillboxes, but against armor that had once been untouchable. They were still dangerous to use. The backblast could betray a man's position, and the short range meant he had to face the tank's guns almost nose to nose. But for the first time, infantrymen could fight back on their own terms. By August, as the Allies broke out of the bocage and raced toward Paris, the M9A1 was everywhere. Engineers rigged them to jeeps. Paratroopers carried them in two halves during night drops. In the hands of determined GIs, they became both a psychological weapon and a practical one, a symbol that American infantry had caught up to German steel. But the Germans were adapting too. The Tigers and Panthers, with armor nearly 6 inches thick at the front, remained nearly invulnerable except from the sides or rear. Tank crews learned to button up and fight from distance. The duel between mobility and armor, between invention and adaptation, tightened like a noose. Still, something fundamental had shifted. The bazooka no longer inspired mockery or mistrust. It gave the common soldier a fighting chance. And in the hedgerows, where every field became a battlefield, that mattered more than any statistic. When Colonel Skinner received the first after-action reports from France, he forwarded them to Uhl's office with a single note. They're calling it the infantry's insurance policy. For Uhl, still stationed stateside, it was both vindication and unease. The M9A1 was effective, yes, but at terrible range, often under 100 yards. Too many of those reports also listed casualties beside the victories. Soldiers had to expose themselves, wait for the right angle, and hope their rocket struck true. The weapon had closed one gap, but not ended the imbalance. That would take another leap, one no less impossible than the first. Ardennes Forest, December 1944. The snow came first, heavy, wet, and silent. Then came the tanks. When Hitler launched his surprise counteroffensive through the Ardennes, the Americans were caught in their foxholes with the kind of disbelief only exhaustion breeds. It was supposed to be a quiet sector. Instead, the woods erupted with the clatter of treads and the stuttering bark of MG-42s. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. At dawn near Bastogne, Lieutenant Bill Harper of the 101st Airborne peered through falling snow at a line of trees that seemed to be moving. Then he saw it, the flat muzzle of a Panther tank, black against the white. "They looked like barns rolling through the woods," he said later. "You could hear the engines before you believed your eyes." His platoon had 2 M9A1 bazookas and 6 rockets between them. Against a Panther, they might as well have been throwing pebbles, unless they could get close, real close. Harper turned to his gunner, Corporal Sam Ricci, a wiry kid from Chicago. "You wait until it turns. Aim for the vents," he said. Ricci nodded, his breath fogging the trigger guard. The Panther advanced slowly, its hull covered in snow and pine boughs, the gun sweeping left and right. They waited until it was less than 70 yards away. When the tank slewed slightly to climb a rise, its rear plate, thin, barely 2 inches of armor, came into view. Ricci fired. The rocket shrieked out in a white arc and struck the rear just above the engine deck. A brief, eerie silence. Then the back of the tank erupted in orange flame. The crew bailed out, one man aflame, running, falling into the snow. The squad erupted in shouts. The bazooka had done the impossible again. But for every tank they stopped, another seemed to appear. Panthers and Mark IVs pressed through the woods, forcing the paratroopers to fight from frozen foxholes and burning villages. Bazooka teams learned to ambush from doorways or ditches, firing from 20 yards, sometimes 10. One veteran of the 99th Infantry Division later recalled, "You didn't fire until you could smell the oil." In those days of ice and chaos, the bazooka became more than a weapon. It was a kind of pact between soldiers. The gunner risked everything to get close, the loader prayed he'd have time to reload, and both trusted that the simple click of the magneto would mean the difference between life and annihilation. By Christmas, Bastogne was surrounded, ammunition low, and morale stretched thin. Yet reports kept coming in of bazooka kills, half-tracks, stugels, even a tiger crippled by a lucky shot into its track sprocket. One after-action report noted dryly, "Enemy armor vulnerable at rear aspect. Recommend more rockets." In the frozen ruins, the bazooka's limitations became its strength. It forced men to stalk tanks like hunters, to fight smarter, closer, more desperate. And that desperation bred innovation. Units began to modify rockets with shaped charges from aircraft munitions. Engineers experimented with larger diameters, stronger explosives. The weapon was evolving again, even as the war closed in around them. When the skies finally cleared and Allied aircraft hammered the German columns, the worst was over. But for the men who'd faced tanks at 50 yards, the lesson was burned in deep. Technology alone never wins. It's the man who dares to use it. For Uhl's design, the Ardennes was its crucible. Against odds, the impossible fix had held. The weapon born in frustration and failure had become a soldier's lifeline, and the enemy's dread. Yet Uhl himself knew it was not the end. In January 1945, he received a cable from Europe requesting a new warhead design, one capable of penetrating even the thick front armor of the latest German tanks. The challenge returned, larger than before. He read it twice, then smiled faintly. "All right," he murmured, "we'll make it work again." Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, spring 1945. Snow still clung to the Maryland pines when Edward Uhl stood once again on the test range, a prototype tube resting against a sandbag. Beside him, an engineer held a clipboard with neat rows of data. M20 prototype, 3.5-inch rocket. Composition B charge. This was not the weapon he'd first been ordered to fix. It was its evolution, the culmination of every field report, every desperate letter from Europe, every engineer's argument about copper cone geometry and explosive velocity. The M20 Super Bazooka was nearly twice as powerful as the one that had first reached Tunisia. Its warhead could punch through nearly 11 inches of armor, enough to destroy even the vaunted Tiger II. When the test officer gave the signal, Uhl watched the rocket flare downrange, its tail sputtering bright against the gray air. The blast struck the plate target with a sharp, hollow clang. Then a molten jet burst through, spitting flame from the far side. "Through and through," the observer called out. Uhl nodded once. It wasn't triumph he felt, but relief. The war was almost over. Germany was collapsing. The need that had driven him, and the men who trusted his invention, was fading at last. Yet he knew this new weapon would see its use. He could already see the next battlefields forming in the distance. Korea, the Cold War, the long shadow of modern mechanized war. Europe, May 1945. The guns fell silent. The ruins of Cologne, Dresden, and Berlin were still smoldering when American soldiers leaned their battered bazookas against walls or tossed them onto trucks. For many, the weapon had been a companion, awkward, temperamental, but faithful. It had given them a fighting chance in moments when courage mattered more than numbers. In after-action interviews, infantrymen spoke with quiet respect. It wasn't perfect, one veteran of the 4th Infantry Division recalled, but when you were staring down a tank, it was the only thing that gave you hope. The Germans, too, had taken note. The fearsome Panzerschreck, literally tank terror, was their direct imitation of Uhl's creation, enlarged to 88 mm caliber. In the end, imitation was the most honest kind of recognition. The bazooka had changed the nature of infantry warfare. It had begun as a desperate experiment, a toy rocket gun, mocked by engineers and doubted by officers. Yet by war's end, it had become a doctrine, the individual soldier as an anti-armor weapon. Back in the States, Uhl packed away his wartime notebooks, calculations scrawled in pencil, drawings of copper cones, field test results. His impossible fix had not been a stroke of genius, but 1,000 small decisions, each one born from failure, observation, and persistence. Years later, when asked how he had done it, he replied simply, "We didn't make it perfect. We just made it good enough for the men who needed it." In that modest answer lay the real legacy of the bazooka, not as a marvel of technology, but as a testament to adaptation under pressure. It was proof that in a war of factories and machines, the human mind, and the will to keep improving, remained the decisive weapon. From the dust of Tunisia to the frozen woods of Bastogne, from a failing gadget to a soldier's salvation, the bazooka's story was never just about steel or explosives. It was about the men who refused to accept impossible as the final word. By the time the next war came, in Korea 1950, soldiers carried the new 3.5-inch model born of Uhl's last wartime tests. It could knock out a T-34 with a single shot. The principle endured, evolving into rocket launchers and guided missiles that followed the same basic idea. One soldier, one shot, against the strongest armor on Earth. The crude steel tube that began as a desperate improvisation in 1942 had become a weapon of history, and behind it all stood one engineer who refused to give up on an idea, who saw, in the spark of a faulty ignition, the promise of a revolution.